For registering for day 3 of our virtual workshop. I hope you've been able to join the past 2 days, and we have 2 more days to come. Before Joya Williams, our program chairman, tells you about our topic and introduces our speaker today, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about our sponsor, Integrity Risk International. Integrity Risk is a provider of a multitude of risk management services, including global enhanced due diligence, accompanied by a comprehensive due diligence online portal, and supported by a database aggregator and other sophisticated technology tools. Integrity Risk also provides services related to beneficial ownership compliance, wealth intelligence, social media diligence, impact investing, and sustainability diligence. They also provide compliance advisory services in several areas, including anti-bribery and corruption and anti-money laundering, among others. Finally, they perform asset inquiries, executive background checks, monitorships, and various safety and security services. A comprehensive compliance services vendor, as you can see. Now let's get our day started, and I'll pass it off to Joya Williams to introduce our speaker and our topic. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Vanessa. Today's webinar is called The Value of Aligning Corporate ESG and Compliance. We are pleased to have Michael Munro as our expert speaker on this topic. Mike Munro has worked for global organizations, addressing a wide range of legal and compliance risks for over 30 years. He's worked for organizations such as Dow Chemical, Baker Hughes, Transocean, and Odebrecht. Mike has assisted these global companies through highly complex issues, including sensitive compliance investigations, the BP Transocean Deepwater Horizon incident, and of course, the Odebrecht corruption scandal. In addition to working for global organizations addressing compliance risk, Mike has been a leader in the global fight against corruption with a focus on business challenges in high-risk jurisdictions. Please welcome Mike Munro. Thank you.
Thank you, Joya. I'm very, very pleased to be here. I know GHBER has played an important role in the compliance community here in Houston for many, many years. But for about 3 years, when I was down in Sao Paulo, Brazil with Odebrecht, I've been in Houston since 2006. Jay Martin, who many of you I'm sure know, this outstanding person and professional, hired me from Dow Chemical and brought me down from Midland, Michigan. And that's Midland, Michigan, not Midland, Texas. So he brought me down here to Houston, and it's been outstanding ever since. Today, we're going to be talking about aligning ESG and compliance, and I am sharing my screen as my mouse jumps around. Okay. And of course, all of us know the importance of compliance, and we understand the value that compliance brings to company. And ESG is quite similar, more broad, but it is definitely similar. What I thought I would do is start off with a bit of history. The first, let's talk about compliance, and I've kind of broken it up into a few periods here. The first I would describe as pre and post Enron. Okay, and of course there are others. There's WorldCom and others around the same 2001 timeframe. Back then, compliance programs were very much in their infancy. Some companies had some form of compliance program. There really weren't chief compliance officers. There really weren't even global directors of compliance. But of course, the legal was very much engaged in addressing investigations and those types of things. And then, of course, Enron hit in 2001. And here in Houston, we clearly know the impact of Enron. And that was really a game changer for compliance. Of course, Sarbanes-Oxley was passed. There was just a major focus on fraud and companies not doing the right thing and the consequence of that. So obviously shareholders lost like $78 billion, and tens of thousands of employees lost their jobs, and pension funds were wiped out. It was just obviously horrendous, but it really caused companies to start focusing more on compliance efforts and business integrity and code of conducts and those types of things. And so that started happening around this time. I was at Dow Chemical at that time, and I was asked to help develop Dow's first global compliance program. And there were associations out there. We started working, I'm sure many of you have heard of LRN. Well, at that time, LRN was this, and it's interesting if you go and look at what their name stands for, that they were really like a legal service documentation type company. They weren't into training at all. And their leader, Doug Seidman, I'd say quite a visionary, realized that this is an important area. And so he began putting in place and developing training modules for compliance. And this was, again, the early 2000s. In Dow, we were one of his first main customers. So, there were conferences and a few things, and everything was moving along, I'd say, steadily. So a number of companies were starting to put in place formal compliance programs. There were, director of compliances. There were some CCOs. And then again, everything changed around the 2007 and 2008 timeframe. And that was the result of, everybody understands, the significant FCPA enforcement actions that started taking place. I was actually at Baker Hughes. That's, I think, one reason why Jay recruited me at the time of the Baker Hughes FCPA settlement. And that was in 2007. At the time of our settlement, it was the largest FCPA fine in history. And it made all the papers and all the press, everyone was talking about it. It was $44 million. And that was in 2007, the largest fine in FCPA history. Well, things changed quickly. Within a year, Siemens hit $800 million fine in total. And you all know the story after that. It's just been, very significant enforcement action. The who's who of companies have been involved. Those of us here in Houston who worked in the oil and gas services company, many of us got pulled into the Panalpina issue in Nigeria. I did it at Transocean. And so we're very aware of these issues. And again, it was a game changer, because although companies were doing some things in regards to compliance and codes of conduct were moving, and again, there are some CCOs, after Siemens in the time periods after 2008, companies realized that this is something that they needed to do. It was extremely important, and the risk was just too high. They couldn't put it off any longer. So there was just been an explosion since that time, where companies, again, put in place full-blown global compliance programs. Most large companies have CCOs, or minimum director of compliance. Companies, moved forward and started, realizing they had to do due diligence on certain high-risk third parties. So the whole due diligence area just took off. Training, communications, all the different elements of compliance programs. Companies went from having no compliance staff to Siemens at the end of their issue had like 700 full-time people in their compliance department. GE had hundreds and hundreds, and again, all major companies had numerous full-time compliance people, where prior there really was none. This continued. The ongoing, major matters and settlements continued. Advent of compliance monitors. All of this has driven just an explosion in compliance programs. Recent developments, and this is more my view, more my opinion, and based on people I talk to, and obviously a lot of benchmarking I continue to do, and friends I have at different companies. But I feel that compliance programs overall have kind of leveled off. The base elements of what is required for a compliance program really has been the same since early 2000s. The compliance program, the basic elements I put in place at Dow Chemical were the same that Jay had at Baker Hughes, and were the same that I implemented at Transocean, and they're the same that I implemented at Odebrecht. The laws that have been passed regarding anti-corruption issues, the required elements of what will constitute an effective program or a program with adequate procedures, the elements are all the same. So people have really just focused on, I would say, more like continuous improvement of the base program elements that have been out there for really almost 20 years now. So it's something that, again, in my mind, has leveled off. There have been recent developments. The technology space is of interest, and so you go out there, and everyone's now talking about artificial intelligence and databases and analytics. So there's data analytics, there's big analytics, there's all kinds of analytics, and they're all good things, and they're all improvements to base compliance programs. But again, in my mind, they're all just like incremental improvements. The other recent development that, I'll be honest, I don't think a lot of people talk about, but I happen to live it. And that was the Odebrecht scandal. And it wasn't the fact that Odebrecht got caught paying close to $1 billion in bribes in 12 different countries around the world. Bribes have been happening for a long time. But what happened at Odebrecht was their settlement. When we settled with the U.S. government, and I wasn't part of the settlement negotiation, I was brought in prior to the settlement to build the Odebrecht First Compliance Program. Excuse me. What happened, and it's typical, the U.S. government required, as part of its plea agreement, to disclose all of the bribes that it knew about as of that day, wherever they occurred. Right? So there's something called, for those of you who are familiar with DPAs and plea agreements, it's something called the statement of facts. So although there, my understanding is we pushed back, and I certainly would have pushed back even more, but what happened is Odebrecht was required in the statement of facts to list out 10 countries where it had evidence, where people had admitted to paying tens of millions of dollars of bribes in, again, 10 different countries. Well, unfortunately, two things. One, the investigations in those countries really had never even begun. All the evidence was based on verbal testimony through interviews by the Brazilian government and the US government. So really full investigations were never completed in those countries before this disclosure. And there was no disclosure to those local countries. Those countries found out about these tens of millions of dollars of bribes being paid when the Odebrecht plea agreement was posted on the US Department of Justice website. That's how they found out about it. And it was a disaster for the company. We had to deal with massive, I don't want to say social unrest. We had thousands of people surrounding our offices, for example, in Lima, Peru, with brooms just pounding on the building. We had millions and billions of dollars of contracts canceled or attempted to be canceled overnight. It was just a major problem. And the biggest problem is these countries did not have a framework to settle with companies the way we do, the way the UK did, the way actually Brazil did by that time. Brazil's Clean Company Act was passed in 2015. But the other countries, Argentina, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Panama, Peru, on and on, Angola, Mozambique, none of those countries had a framework for settlement. So when the company, at the requirement of the DOJ, disclosed all of these settlements, it was pandemonium. And Odebrecht business, the company's still in business, but I would say barely. When I joined Odebrecht, they had over 200,000 employees globally. They're down to a few 10,000, 20. There's a subsidiary that has a few more. The company completely, I don't say wiped out because they're still in business. They're still a fantastic company. But the risk profile of companies settling and disclosing bribes in other parts of the world where the US government doesn't have already good relationships. So after Odebrecht, there's a couple settlement in Singapore and Brazil, went wonderfully. The DOJ, Singapore government, they all just did a great job in settling. But beyond that, there's a huge risk in disclosure. So that's just something I wanted to point out because I actually lived it. ESG, that's the topic that, again, we'd like to focus on really the rest of the time we have here. ESG, the concepts actually began with sustainability reporting. And that began in the late 1980s. Actually, it started in the chemical industry. It started Dow Chemical, where I was one of the first companies that started doing sustainability reports. Now, the reason was purely, well, I don't say purely, because it is a good thing to do, but the reason was focused on reputation. The chemical industry back then, in the late 80s and 90s, when I joined Dow, had a horrendous reputation, just in general. Bhopal had hit with Union Carbide, dioxin. Dow made actually chlorine, and dioxin's a byproduct of chlorine. Dow made Agent Orange, that was used in Vietnam. I mean, there was just a huge reputational issue for chemical companies back then. So they began, and again, Dow was one of the leaders, to do sustainability reports. They began talking about, these are the things that we're going to do. We are much more than all of these negative things that are in the press. We are doing all of these good things for the world, and we're going to continue to do them. And everything very, very accurate. So chemical companies started sustainability reports. Other companies began reporting on their goals, principally their goals. No requirements per se, but this is what we're going to do in these areas. This is how we're going to improve. Yeah, we're involved in this much water pollution today, but our goal is to reduce 30% in 5 years. So again, that all started with sustainability reports and very, very positive. Well, interestingly, the first time ESG, that at least most people can see when it was used at the beginning, was not until 2006 when the United Nations issued a document relating to investment principles. And in that document, they referenced ESG. And the principles document from 2006 talks about the importance of considering criteria other than just financial criteria for investment decisions, right? And so that was the first time that, again, most people can find ESG per se had been referenced, right? And at that point and continuing, I would say there was a gradual and a continual emphasis on ESG, and ESG was the phrase was used more and more over the years. A number of agencies formed and started putting in place metrics, and there's different GRI and a whole number of other ones, because everyone figured out even back then, well, if you're going to say you're going to do something, it's much better and important to actually have specific KPIs, specific goals, and then you say you're going to meet them, and then you track them, and so on and so forth. So numerous different metrics over the past 10, 15 years have come out, and I'm talking numerous. Now they're all around the concepts of the environment, social, and governance. All three very, very important things. But again, things had been moving along and had been getting more press, and importantly, investors in the past, I'd say 4 to 5 years, started talking more and more about ESG, and of course the importance and the publicity around climate change. It just had a huge impact. So where there are a number of very important climate change focused rating agencies, those are also pulled into the environment element of ESG. So things, again, we're moving along. BlackRock, about 4 years ago, put in place a whole team that started emphasizing ESG and the fact that they're going to start making investment decisions based on whether or not companies are doing and addressing ESG. And BlackRock's the largest investment firm, like $6-7 trillion in investment assets at their disposal, and so that that's had an impact. So again, more and more people were talking about it, but where things in my mind have really made a sea change, and I actually equate this back to 2001 with Enron, 2008 with Siemens, and that is in 2020 and 2021 there were a number of very significant developments that cumulative has really gotten a lot of people's attention, really gotten their attention. A couple of them I'll mention. One is that those whole bunch of different rating agencies I mentioned to you or earlier, they have decided and they understand they got to start getting together and coming up with a standard, because today there's no standard, and so they really have to start doing that. So they actually, 5 of them got together and issued a statement of work that we're going to work together last November. What came out in the exact same time period, and this is very significant, and I'm sure all of you will understand, is the Big Four got together. And they've been working on this for a while. The Big Four understands the importance and the value of ESG reporting. And so the Big Four has been working on, as well as others, the concept that sustainability standards are going to be equivalent to financial standards. And whereas on an annual basis and quarterly basis and even monthly basis, companies should be tracking sustainability metrics, and those should be reported, and they should be audited, and that all should be part of the financial review that auditing companies do. So it's a huge amount of work and really a sea change. If in fact these ESG metrics become a standard like financial standards, all companies, and for sure all publicly traded companies and any major company that says that they are following what is recommended by the financial standard boards will have to track these metrics and report on them on quarterly and annual basis. So the Big Four actually got together with the World Economic Forum. You can Google it, read it. They issued a report, the World Economic Forum did, and they have their own metrics. Now, again, they're consistent. They're very good. They're well written. They're all important, but they've issued their own standards that they would like companies and ultimately the standard boards to adopt and mandate for companies. So those are out there. That again is sea change, because the Big Four are fantastic organizations and they have a lot of influence, and they see the importance of this. It's another tidbit, which is easily, you can take a look. PwC currently is hiring numerous, hundreds of directors of ESG. All of the main offices are hiring directors of ESG around the United States. So there's just a big focus on this. There has been combination of a few of the rating agencies. The Biden election was very important and significant for what's going on in the ESG space, in particular climate. There has been already the SEC has issued comments or draft proposals out there for requirements for ESG reporting. NASDAQ for years has had recommendations, but that could turn to requirements at some point. All of this has been happening in just the past year. Well, an issue that I'm actually working on is I was asked, and because of my experience at Odebrecht, in fact, that Odebrecht was one of the world's largest engineering construction companies, building $5 billion dams and multi-billion-dollar subways for decades now. I was asked to participate in an OECD executive committee that is working with the governments of the US, Japan, and Australia. And what they're doing is they're putting in place something called the Blue Dot Network, which is going to put in place a certification process, an ESG-related certification process for any large infrastructure project. The spend on infrastructure over the next 5 years is, as we all know, is in the trillions globally. And what is being proposed, and we're actually working on it today, and it's expected it's going to be rolled out at the end of this year, is that projects are going to have to go through a formal certification process for each of those areas. And they're talking now it's going to be voluntary, but the government's pretty clear that they're going to want it done, and financing and everything else could be tied to it. But company projects are going to have to go through a formal certification process, demonstrate that they are addressing the important areas of ESG as well as financial, be reviewed, be certified, and then be audited over the life cycle of the project. So it's just a significant development. Move on to next. So with that, I will now just briefly talk about some of the similarities and differences in regards to ESG and compliance, and why, based on my title, I truly believe there is huge value in aligning ESG and compliance. First, both ESG and compliance are based on business integrity and a corporation's core values. Both, no question. What does the company stand for? What are its values? All we know, extremely important and seemingly becoming more and more important by the day. So they're both tied to those concepts. These issues are very important to board of directors, as we all know, to executive management, and both really requires tone-to-top buy-in. These things do not happen, as I'm sure you all know, unless top management and ultimately the board of directors say, this is a good thing, we're going to do it. The issues are absolutely global. Global companies that many of us work for have to look at all their areas of the world to determine whether or not they are doing the right things. And it's cross-functional. We already in compliance, we work with HR, we work with internal audit, we work with IT, we work with, the list goes on, sales and so on and so forth. ESG is absolutely the same. It's all cross-functional. Continual training and communications are absolutely required. It's going to be key going forward. It's essential to track and prove a company's activity in these areas and its results in both of the areas. So there's a lot of tracking. You just don't do these things. You need to track them. You need to be able to document what you've done to ensure if there's a problem that you have a defense, or to demonstrate with ESG as well as compliance that you're a good corporate citizen. So that's extremely important. Supply chain and know your vendors are very important in both ESG and compliance. And finally, there's really no one way, which is, I think, positive in many respects. Companies today, even in compliance, we all know it's been around for a long time. We all know the elements are the same, but you can take a look at one global company next to another, next to another. Some may have a compliance function of 100. Some may have a compliance function of 20. Some companies do a due diligence just on a formal due diligence, just on their very highest risk vendors. Some companies are moving to do formal due diligence on everybody, even beyond, the review of the third-party risk lists. It's just, companies are all over the board in how they have implemented both compliance, and for the ones that have implemented ESG. There's no one way, and there's lots of opinions. So again, that's very similar between the two. Now let's talk about the differences. ESG is primarily investor-driven today. Now, primarily. The investors are pushing hard ESG. Governments are as well, more and more. Obviously, many governments in Europe, our current government in the United States, they're importantly and positively pushing these issues for companies to address them. So, but it's really investor-driven, I would say, more. Compliance really, in my mind, has been more legal and enforcement driven. Companies who did the most with their compliance programs, typically, it's not, I don't like to generalize too much, but typically were the ones that got in trouble. Siemens and others, really did a lot. Odebrecht, we of course did a lot. But of course, and again, there's clearly overlaps. A compliance issue impacts the reputation, which then impacts whether or not investors are going to invest in you. So there's clearly overlaps, but I'd say primarily the drivers are those. Another difference is there today, as I mentioned, really is a consensus on the different elements of what constitutes a good, effective, here in the US, compliance program. Okay? And so that's clear. And the leadership structures real consistent. So you typically have a CCO, or you have a director of global compliance for global companies. She or he then has some reports, typically always for large companies, and they can be lawyers, often paralegals, key administrators, people like. So the structure is really clear, and you can look at most global companies today, and it's similar. Right? That is not the case for ESG. It's, again, people really, in some sense, don't know what to do with it because of its history in sustainability. Talk about Dow, focused on rebuilding reputations. Actually, communications for years has been the lead in sustainability, and it continued, and it is today in some companies, on ESG issues, where communications has kind of brought everything together and helped decide what the issues are. And there's other groups. Sometimes you'll take a head of environmental if environmental is very important for your business, and you make him or her head of the compliance or the ESG effort. There are companies, and personally, I think it's going to be more of the trend. There are companies that have put ESG under compliance and under chief compliance officers, and there's some in Houston that today are CCOs. They're also over ESG, and they're also over enterprise risk management. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. So, but today, no consistency, and people are hiring, vice presidents, high level, vice presidents, huge global companies of ESG, and they're not requiring necessarily a compliance background, and others are looking. So, but bottom line, this is all new. There's no consistency for ESG. We all know compliance is a lot of well-established processes, systems, lots of consultants for compliance. ESG, not so much. It's again, just starting. Finally, the focus and importance of ESG, in my opinion, is likely to significantly increase over the next few years. Whereas compliance, it's going to remain important. It is extremely important. My view is it's going to be steady. Still focused on continuous improvement, but overall, it's going to be steady. Final slide. Why align ESG in compliance? And I've mentioned a few things, and I've talked a lot about a number of the similarities. I think there's no question that the current compliance expertise, processes, and systems that many of your companies have in place today can be leveraged in the ESG space. Okay? No doubt about it. They can be leveraged. Okay? They don't fit exactly, but they can be leveraged. The second point is that key compliance areas are already part of governance. So typically today, what is being suggested in the governance space that is related to compliance, which should be tracked and reported, and I guarantee you this will expand over time, it's relatively limited. What most of the rating agencies want companies to talk about and track is anti-corruption, what they are doing or what they have in place to address anti-corruption. And it's more some of the metrics is, how many bribes, were you involved in or were disclosed, or, very sensitive areas, by the way. But it's relatively limited. Whistleblower helplines, which of course most of us manage in compliance. That's a key part of governance. But there's not a lot more today. Some antitrust the violations are being asked to be tracked and disclosed and talked about. But other than that, under governance, there's not a lot related to compliance. Now there's a lot more under governance that you're looking at, board structure and the corporate governance and reporting and how you do those things. So there is more under governance, but not necessarily our area of compliance. But clearly antitrust is a huge area for us. So again, some key compliance areas are already part of governance, and governance is definitely part of ESG. No doubt. Next point. Other aspects of ESG and compliance are also involved, and they're also legal related. So when you're talking about ESG today on the environmental side, I'm sure we all understand, there are certain things that need to be reported when a company has a spill. They are mandated to report issues to country environmental protection agencies here in the United States and others around the world when there's a spill in a couple in a certain country. So there's already these legal requirements for tracking of important environmental related data, and if there's an incident, it must be reported. Certainly that's the case in the safety area. Same thing. There's laws that require reporting today, and that's something that's clear. On the social side, there's different things that have to be reported, and there's different laws and regulations that currently impact. And the bottom line is there's going to be more in the future. Next, ESG and compliance involve very sensitive issues, which need to be carefully addressed. Okay? Part of the, I think, risk here is that as people are running off talking about ESG and the importance of transparency, which transparency is important and good, they're not always looking at the risk of disclosure and the risk of litigation that many of us know all too well here in the United States, and how that needs to be balanced and worked through. These are very sensitive issues where chief compliance officers, general counsels, legal, who typically have focused on compliance programs, bring a lot of value to the table when you're talking about ESG disclosures and reporting. And then finally, I believe the current stature, experience, and skill sets of CCOs and their teams bring a lot of value to ESG. Compliance professionals, chief compliance officers, directors of compliance are highly respected within our organizations. They have built a track record of focusing on doing the right things. The vast majority of us are very reasonable, nice people. We've done a good job, and having that type of reputation already within a company, I believe, adds significant value for us to begin working in these other areas, helping companies determine what are they going to do with ESG. Because again, ESG is going to increase. Google ESG, Google the next couple of years, see what's out there. The press, everything else is moving, and it's all good, because ultimately ESG is like what we've been doing for years now in compliance. Many of us have been fighting against corruption, fighting against bribery, fighting against things that really hurt people and whole societies. And that's exactly what's going on with ESG. So with that, I will turn over the questions.
Great, thank you, Mike. Appreciate the presentation, very informative. And we've got a couple of questions here. The first one is related to your work in Brazil. It says, can you tell us the environment in Brazil and what it is like now as a result of the Odebrecht incidents? And have other companies in Brazil responded to this, and what are they doing to avoid similar issues? Do you see improvements in that area?
There were significant improvements. Operation Car Wash, Lava Jato, the Petrobras, all of that, the Odebrecht case, just again, a sea change within Brazil. I've been working in Brazil for close to 30 years. Dow has a very large presence in Brazil, and every company, Transocean, I ever worked for. A complete sea change from 2015 on. The issues of corruption, third-party due diligence, helplines, code of conduct, all of those things took off amazingly and very positively, and they really got a foothold. So many major companies, I'm sure a number of you heard of EMBRER. You've flown EMBRER jets all over the world. Well, EMBRER is a Brazilian company. EMBRER had a significant FCPA issue. They had a compliance monitor, and so that got a lot of people's attention. So bottom line, the major companies very quickly, including Odebrecht, adopted Western style compliance programs and their law, the Brazilian Clean Company Act, list it out instead of, like 6 in the UK. Brazilians love to talk, so there's like 15. And so, but they're all the same. And so major change in the big companies and even the smaller companies and in the laws and the focus. There's been issues the past couple of years, and I'm not going to get into the politics, but there has been issues. I wouldn't say that any of the good things that were done and continuing today have been thrown out, or they're not being followed anymore. I'm still good friends with Odebrecht. They just got certified by ISO 37001. Just fantastic. They just got out of their monitorship a few months ago. Chuck DeRoss signed off on them as having an outstanding compliance program. The companies are still doing the right thing, but there's issues, significant issues, and so it's a challenge. I have every bit of confidence that it's not going to go backwards. Unfortunately, people are still people, and people are still doing things that aren't right. COVID has just devastated, and still is the country. So there's significant issues, and so that's so. Bottom line, major change. I'm confident people should do business there, continue to do business there. Got to be careful, no doubt about it. But it's major change for the positive, and I'm confident that will continue. It's slowed down, to be honest, these major changes, but it will continue. And if things change in other areas, there's no reason things will not take off again like they were, a couple of years ago.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I'm curious, kind of a side question about all of Latin America. I think this has raised awareness down there. Do you feel the same way about?
Oh yeah. Odebrecht. We were in the front. I spent a year and a half traveling to all those countries and giving press conferences and interviews, and it was all of those major countries. It just took them by storm, and all of them, the ones that didn't have the laws, and none of them had a law to deal with these issues directly, but some would take existing laws and kind of modify it. Most of the countries in the past 2 years since Odebrecht passed anti-corruption laws, passed laws that allow companies to be criminally prosecuted, and therefore they can settle. And that's kind of the issue. Before, you couldn't even charge a company with a crime before these laws. So all of that's been done. Major sea change. Compliance organizations have popped up. I actually just gave a keynote address to the Argentinian Compliance Association a week ago. We had 1,300 attendees for this conference. It was a full day conference. Just so much interest. The people down there, that they're fed up with corruption. That's why there was a lot of political change. Most presidents were involved in the Odebrecht, former presidents, current presidents, and the Odebrecht bribes. Major change. Lots of interest. And most of Latin America, there have been some issues, again, in the Syria politics, but things are going well, and again, I think they're going to continue. And the ESG area is going to help all of that, because that's where now you're getting investors. That's where now you're getting banks, more focused financiers, the World Bank, others that are going to start really requiring metrics and KPIs in the compliance area as well. And that's different.
Well, great. Well, thank you. Yeah. And one last question about that, and then we've got a couple more. I was wondering, have you seen The Mechanism, or O Mecanismo, the Netflix special about the Lava Jato?
Yes. And I've also seen Deepwater Horizon. So, and I've been very disappointed. I was not in either one of those movies, or the Netflix shows, but.
So let me. Thank you. Let me jump to a question from Terry Stringer. Terry asked, you spoke about the transparency requirements that are starting to manifest with ESG reporting. Do you have any advice for us on how to weigh in, frame, or balance these emerging transparency desires and what we would like to disclose?
I think it's very important that people weigh in, and ultimately, probably the best way to weigh in is to make decisions on what areas you are going to track and ultimately report on, and think about starting to do that. The problem I see right now is a lot of companies, I'd even say most companies, aren't really reporting on anything. And they're doing a lot of good things in all of these areas. So they're getting a lot of pressure. They're getting pressure by investors. They're getting pressure by boards. And people are saying, well, you need to start doing these things. Well, a lot of companies are tracking a lot of ESG related information, but they're just not doing it on a formal way. And the issue with that is that a lot of companies, because they're not setting baselines. What is very helpful and good about what's being expected in the area of ESG, and it goes back to the sustainability days, a lot of what's being asked for is people want to see an improvement over time. They want to see now commitments made that we're going to get from A to D over X period of time. Well, if a company doesn't set a baseline, sooner than later, you're going to be in a position, we're going to be in a position where we're going to make some good changes, very, valuable changes. But since we never set a baseline, when we go ahead and we're required to do these reports, our trends are not going to look as good as they would have if we would have at least started tracking this information on a global basis early on. Okay. So now more direct, how do we provide input? The problem with providing direct input today is it's still not clear, and I'm going to be somewhat blunt, who's the winner is going to be. What is the ESG metrics that are ultimately going to be used for the global standard? Okay, it's not clear. You have SASB, who I would say, be careful, is very high up there, and actually BlackRock is tied, and it uses references SASB. Chevron's Sustain ESG report references SASB. The other big one, of course, is GRI, but they're different. There's one has 100, one's industry based. Now GRI is going to industry based, but it's just not clear. But what they are doing, GRI right now is moving to an industry based. They are going out. You can have somebody in your company, even communication, someone on your team, and they're asking for input regarding their new standards. SASB has done that for years. Now, look for those, and I think it's important to give input. The SEC has just asked for input. So I think it is important for companies to speak out and directly give input. Now, how much impact one company is going to have, don't know, but where you can have impact is with your industry associations. So the best answer in my mind is get with your industry associations, have their people that do this all the time, on the lobbying side, for those who lobby, of course, legally and appropriately, have them provide input. Because we all know there's much more. The Chemical Association, ACD, Dow is involved in, very important, IEDC, others. Have your associations start looking for opportunities to provide input.
Great. And I think there was another question in here about that. Why should companies begin to implement ESG reporting? And I think there's no common standard, and I think you answered that one. And then we've got one more. Actually, we have two more. What are some concerns about companies should have about ESG reporting?
Yeah. I briefly mentioned that. That's one of my main concerns, that people sometimes don't properly look at these issues and take all the implications of what could happen through this push of open transparency and the consequences of all that. Right? And the understanding that once you start disclosing these things, you have to continue. Right? And so therefore you need to be careful. You know, it'd be very difficult for a company to say, okay, we're going to start reporting on our greenhouse gas and, you know, our use of clean water, and we're going to report that, and they have a bad year, something happens, there's an upset, they, you know, whatever, and they have a real bad year and their numbers look horrible. There's just all kinds of issues. And importantly, there's litigation concerns. And there's impact. There's a big push to, and there has been for years, to be transparent on, you know, corruption-related matters. Well, at Transocean, we were required, like Odebrecht, to disclose that, you know, we violated customs laws in Nigeria. Okay, tried to tell people it's not a good idea to report this publicly. We knew it was going to happen. We reported it, and part of our plea agreement, within 2 days, a convoy of police came to our Lagos office in Nigeria, and they hauled away our managing director, who had only been with the company for 6 months. And the next day, they hauled away to jail the supply chain manager because we disclosed it. So people need to be very careful and don't even, you know, don't just look at, you know, how's this going to be looked at and viewed in the EU and in the United States? What's going to happen in the rest of the world? And so again, lots of concerns. And that's why I am part of going to start talking a lot about where compliance and legal, I believe, should be engaged in what's going to happen, I think, very quickly and significantly over the next months and years ahead.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then what do you think is the most significant impediment to aligning ESG to compliance? So you spoke about that a little earlier.
Yeah, I think it's more just lack of consistency, lack of companies really knowing what to do with it. Also, you know, most of us are very busy, and, you know, everyone's not looking to expand their job by pretty significant percent without more resources. Of course, we all know sometimes they say, oh yeah, we have this new great work for you, but then they don't add the resources. So there's all of that. There's uncertainty. There's, you know, no consistent approach, as I mentioned, to how this should work, you know, going forward. And so that I think is the biggest impediment. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I think we see a lot of, like you said in your presentation, a lot of this data is being recorded, but it's not always in the compliance department. So it really takes collaboration across multiple areas. So anyway, well, thank you, Mike, for your presentation. I'll hand it off to Joya, and you'll be at the dinner tonight, is that correct?
Yes, I will. Yeah,
all right, so if anyone has additional questions, you can see Mike tonight in person. Joya, I'll let you take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again to our speaker, Mike Munro, for this insightful webinar today. Thank you again to Integrity Risk International for sponsoring our workshop platform this week. And thank you to the GHBER Board of Directors. The recording and the slides will be posted on the GHBER website by next week. The Texas Bar CLE hours have been approved, 1 hour of CLE each day, with the Friday webinar being approved as an ethics hour. The course information will be posted on the GHBER website. You will have to report your own CLE, as GHBER does not report hours to the bar for attendees. We hope you can join us tomorrow. The webinar is called How to Maintain a Speak Up Culture, and our speaker will be Chief Compliance Officer Justin Ross of Federal Express. If you haven't already registered, please do so on the GHBER website. Please remember, tonight is our networking dinner at the Good Company Seafood Memorial City location, starting at 6:30. Hope to see you there. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining. Make it a great day. Goodbye.